like to welcome everybody and start our first brown bag in the winter quarter. Today is very exciting that we have Jenny today to talk to us about shifting face of feminism, gender, culture, and development in the global world. This is the second time Jennifer did the brown bag for us. Last time, the first time, when I was the coordinator, it was in the winter 2014. Her topic is global education and public health at that time. And today is a very, very privilege, to have Jennifer to talk to us. And I'd like you to introduce your job here and at Easton for us. Did you do that?
Thank you very much. No. So I am working at SFCC with Bonnie Brunt, the administrative assistant for the Visual and Performing Arts Division. And I also had been asked by Eastern last semester. I'm an adjunct professor at Eastern. I taught 2 of their Introduction to Public Health courses in their Masters of Public Health program, which is what I have my degree in, last semester, and then I'm translating those courses as online courses this semester. So it is an honor and a privilege, as always, to be here, able to present to the SFCC faculty brown bag. And thank you all for making this an opportunity. I'm going to see if I can end by 12:30 because some people are needing to leave, but we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards. These are a few of the references I've been drawing on today. I'm going to be talking to some part about Iran and the Muslim world and the Middle East. And it's partly an homage to one of my former anthropology professors, Lois Beck. She and Nikki Ketty had written the seminal work on women in the Muslim world back in the late 70s. And Lois's voice is one of the strong women's voices that's been in my head over the last couple as I've been working in women's and empowerment issues, studying them and also as a global health and global development worker trying to put these into practice. I wanted to start today with a true story from one of the women I knew in Kathmandu when I was working with Save the Children in the mid-90s. I will call her Ronnie. She was a good friend of my landlord, and both my landlord and Ronnie were unconventional women. My landlord, they were both upper class and upper caste women. My landlord had an arranged marriage with a childhood friend since she was young. She decided she would not go through with that arranged marriage and hold out for a love marriage instead, much to the consternation of both families, and there was a lot of society gossip around that. But her friend Ronnie caused even more of an issue in Kathmandu society. Ronnie had several siblings. She had no brothers in her family. And that's an issue in countries like Nepal because sons are very important. One of the reasons why is for the burial rites when one's parents die. Like, this is a photo of the famous Pashupatinath temple in Kathmandu where you would perform the burial rites and cremation for families. And it's the son's sacred responsibility to perform these rites for his parents when they die. Ronnie, having no brothers, decided that she was not going to ask another male relative to do this, but she shaved her head and performed the burial rites herself. And this caused a great deal of stir in Kathmandu society, having her do this. Act was, of course, an act of piety, but it could also be seen as an act to try to expand women's roles and status within Kathmandu society. I know from having talked with a number of the upper caste and upper class women in Kathmandu that they were intentionally looking at feminism ideology as they were trying to look at how they could change their own gender roles and responsibilities within Nepali society. For me, both as an anthropologist and as a development worker, this caused me to have some tension, because as an anthropologist, anthropology has deep roots in cultural relativism, the idea that what people do in their cultures, they have very good reasons for the different things that we do, and we need to be non-judgmental in looking at what they do in cultures. As a development worker, as much as I support global development work, it can sometimes be seen as a machine that can just run on its own agenda and its own accord, and it has some imperialistic roots, even though Nepal had never been a British colony. There's a huge power differential between the global north, the wealthy countries of the world, and the global south. And even when global development workers like me as an expat are going in there trying to help them, there can be, it can cause a lot of tensions. And so I didn't want Ronnie, in looking at Western feminism as our model, to necessarily be losing her own voice as a Nepali woman in figuring out how to do this. And so this is just an example of something I'll talk about today, of some of the tensions between cultural relativism on the one hand and this sense that there are universal human rights that apply to people in all cultures on the other. The global development world started about the 1950s, and gender and global development has long been a part of it. This is from the most recent policy statement from USAID on gender equality and female empowerment in 2012. Hillary Clinton says, "Achieving our objectives for development will demand accelerated efforts to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment. Otherwise, peace and prosperity will have their own glass ceiling." There's been, while women's equality and women's empowerment has been a part of global development since the 50s, it has been, in the last 15 to 20 years, particularly elevated on the global stage in terms of increasing legitimacy. A lot of the human rights started out in 1948 with the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And some of the key landmarks: in 1974, USAID, the Agency for International Development, established the Office of Women in Development. The UN established other women in development programs, most notably the UNIFEM in the 80s. In the mid-90s, there were a couple of conferences, the Cairo Conference on Population and Development and the Beijing Women's Conference, that started to elevate even more discourse on women's rights, women's empowerment at a international conference level, which is where you begin to get the countries and leaders, country leaders involved and on board. With the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals in the 2000s, for the first time with the Millennium Development Goals, globally, across all the countries of the world, they established a set of goals, a common set of goals and indicators that they were going to be focusing on at a country level, at an organizational level. And so promoting gender equality and empowering women is goal number 3 with the Millennium Development Goals. This past fall, they just created the Sustainable Development Goals, and number 5 looks at gender equality, as well as things like education, workforce sustainability, ending poverty, improving health, all those kinds of things. So while there's been a lot at the international stage on really trying to legitimize some of the global equity and global empowerment issues, what happens at the UN level and at the country level doesn't necessarily play out in countries, communities, families, or individuals when you're looking at women's roles and empowerment. So I wanted to take some time looking at the issue of veiling and seclusion in the Muslim world, because this is often something that, for a Western feminist like me, I tend to see it as a sort of oppression, that women are being oppressed by not having the freedom of choice to go out and be a part of public society. But what I want to share is that this is not necessarily, that there are more nuances around this than just a simple black and white issue. A lot of times veiling has been associated by Muslims and non-Muslims with Islam, and there have been countries like France and other European countries have banned the use of different face veils, burqas, in their own countries, and this happened in France in 2010 and 2014. There was a girl attending the Camden School for Girls in North London who was banned from school because she insisted on wearing the niqab. And there have been Muslim women who talk about their right to wear the hijab, just the scarf, my choice, my right, my life, which is terminology that for me resonates very much from women's reproductive health, pro-choice, that kind of thing. And so veiling and seclusion is a symbol that have people coming down on both sides, and it's been used in different ways for quite a long time. I want to take a brief moment and look a little at the history of women in Islam. A lot of times Islam has been seen as being oppressive of women, and that issues like veiling and seclusion have been associated strongly with it. But some of the issues around veiling and seclusion had happened for millennia before Prophet Muhammad was even born. And they are from some of the cultural and social traditions that were in pre-Islamic times, even back with the Persian Empire, and earlier when you're looking at Sumer and Mesopotamia and the very beginning of where people were beginning to shift from being nomadic and hunters and gatherers to settling into agriculture, that began to change women's status and women's roles to be associated more with the household, more with childcare, while men were associated with more with trade or other kinds of roles that left them broader access. Urbanization, even as far back as Sumer and Mesopotamia, which was when some of the first early towns began to be developed, also meant that women that there was this slow shift towards secluding women from public spaces in this particular part of the world. For example, a lot of the societies are patrilineal in descent, so any inheritance is the male line, and when you're dealing with wealthier people, that means it's really important to make sure that you know that if that's your son who's going to be getting the inheritance, that that's your son and not some other man's son. And so with shift to urbanization and more patrilineal societies, there was more of a focus on keeping women safe from strangers so that they could make sure that the patrilineal line was safe and secure. And in towns, it's you're surrounded with more strangers than you are in rural areas where you tend to know everybody and strangers stick out. So you tended to have more of a control of women through veiling and seclusion to keep them and their honor safe. There was also a religion that had been very strong at that time, Zoroastrianism, which had very stringent regulations on women, women's purity, and that kind of thing. So when Prophet Muhammad was born, Islam actually came out of a nomadic Arab origin, and the nomads and the Arabs were not sedentary, urbanized, and so they tended to have a different view on women's roles. And what's happened in terms of modern day Islam, the Sharia is the Islamic law, and there have been two divergent origins of Sharia. And this happens with Christianity and other kinds of world religions as well. One is looking at the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad and the example of Muhammad. And it turns out Muhammad had actually tried to and put into place some more liberal teaching with regards to women's roles and empowerment than had been present in the past. One example would be previously when a woman would get married, any inheritance like bride price or marriage fee that would go with her would be given to her father, not to her. Muhammad established in the Quran that that kind of bride price went to the woman, not to her father. And even though there were things like men can have 4 wives and men can divorce a wife just by saying, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you 3 times, and women don't have that same kind of equality in terms of divorcing men. Muhammad did put in the Quran the fact that men, if they divorced their wives, were supposed to take care of them and were not able to take any of the monies that they had had from them. And so and this was not the same as had been happening in the pre-Islamic non-Arabic traditions. So one example in the Quran, if you had adultery, Muhammad said you just get 100 lashes if you're an adulterer. In the pre-Islamic, it had death, stoning. But after Muhammad died and as Islam grew as a religion, the Arabs who were conquering the Islamic world at that time were the minority, and the pre-Islamic non-Arabic people were the majority. And so slowly these non-Arabic traditions from Zoroastrianism and others modified what was known as the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad and made them more conservative. So there was a great legist who said that adultery should be stoning, and by the 2nd and 3rd Islamic century, a lot of the traditions that had not been from Muhammad, but that had been pre-Islamic, had been assimilated into Islam, and people were now saying, this is from the Quran, this is one of the hadiths of the Muhammad, and we should accept this as sacred writings, even though that was not the case. So briefly, in this period, I wanted to talk about some of the women who had found ways to influence society and what was happening, even though they were being more and more shunted out of the public space and into veiling seclusion, harems, etc. So in the 11th century, one women could have influence was with religious scholarship. And there was a famous woman, Fatima bint, I don't know quite how to pronounce this, Abi Ali al-Dakak. She was a wife of what turned out to be a very famous Sufi teacher. She was known to be a teacher in her own right and was known, books had been written about her teaching from several hundred miles away from where she was living, and she would be able to publicly teach people as well. This is a picture of a Sufi dance, and it's one of the few that has the 4 women and children in white are usually not depicted, but they are depicted here. So it's just an example of some of the ways in which women could exhibit some influence in the society. Looking in the 15th and 16th centuries in Iran, a lot of what is found in the historical writings are from the wealthier women, the more elite women, not the working women. But women, through marriage and royal marriage, would be able to have an influence on policy, and women also they were able to keep their own wealth in a lot of cases, and so they would give to charitable foundations like Bija, who was an astrologer and who was famous for some of the astrological calendars that she had done, as well as charitable works and foundations. There are a number of women who had even had huge monuments made and with their names inscribed on them, so it wasn't just the men getting the long-lasting glory, but some of the women as well. Under one of the Shahs, there was a woman who was married to a doctor who was a court physician, but she was also a court physician in her own right. And then Keralnisa Begum, she was the mother of one of the sultans. When there was a part of Iran that she basically ruled while the Shah who was in charge was ill, and when they had had a military conquest, a lot of the military leaders weren't willing to step up and do anything about it. But she actually led an army over snow-capped mountains against Medea and moved this conquest forward. So it wasn't like just because women were secluded and out of the public sphere that they were not part of society at all. A last thing, looking historically, there's a very famous epic called Khusrau and Shirin. It was widely copied in epic literature, and it's Nizami, and he ended up creating a very strong female protagonist. This was not a submissive. She was born in Armenia, and she ended up marrying one of the Khusrau, who was one of the leaders, the Shah, basically, and it has some tragic elements and all that kind of stuff, and it would be interesting to read if you ever wanted to. But the author talks about how she wasn't submissive at all, and she was very different as a female protagonist than a lot of the normal ones are. And he says that basically to have a female heroine as strong as she was meant that even in the 1200s in the Persian culture, you had to have cultural space available for this to be looked at as even possible. It wasn't something that nobody had ever heard of. And the author patterned Shirin after his wife. Looking in the 1970s, the Qashqai nomads in Iran, they in some ways encapsulate in a microcosm some of the changes that we talked about historically that had been happening in Iran. The Qashqai nomads, as opposed to some of the other nomadic groups, are more egalitarian, and there was a lot more interconnection between male and female roles in the nomadic lifestyle there. For example, in the encampment, when you had the nomads, the women were responsible for each of their own household tents, but they would, when they encamped, they would have the tents spread out. And the men were responsible for trading and politics, but the women had been responsible for actually making the goods that producing the milk and the cheese and the carpets and other goods that would sustain the families. And in these encampments, when the men weren't there, the women would, Beck says that the women would be running around very noisy, very loud, talking to each other everywhere. When the men would show up, the women would stay in their own household tents and not talk that much. But when the nomads with development and the development of the market economy in the 70s, nomadic groups in Iran began to settle into the cities. And so some of the shifts in the roles, women's roles that happened with this were when they started settling into cities, they were no longer subsistence as self-sufficient, and when money started coming from agriculture or from market goods, those were areas that the men controlled, and so the women's roles as producers of these self-sufficient goods for their own family, their status and power declined. They also there became mechanized forms of doing the nomadic shift with truck or whatever instead of camel. And so that meant that you could do a migration of your herds within a couple of days instead of several weeks. And that meant that women who had been an important connective part of the tribe lost that connection. And because these mechanized forms of transport were what the men would take on, the men's roles increased because they were the ones in charge of this cool new technology, and the women's roles decreased. And when they settled into urban centers, like we had seen historically, the women started becoming responsible for the children in the household, and they lost a lot of the freedom that they'd had when they were in the nomadic encampments. One of the stories that Lois says about veiling, a lot of times nomadic women would not be veiled when they were in their encampments, but they would sometimes put on veils when they went to the cities. And she said the only time you ever really saw anybody wearing a chador, the full-length veil, were the men in the nomadic encampments when the man would lie down for a nap and ask for one of the chadors to be pulled out so he could put it over his face to keep the flies away. So even though the market economy had led to some downshifts in women's status in some cases, external forces don't always create the same kind of effect. For example, both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia are nomadic countries, and they are both very oil rich. Kuwait decided to emulate the West and other Western Arab countries. So women began driving, they didn't wear veils, they wore Western dress, they worked in offices alongside with men, while in Saudi Arabia, same kind of background, they decided not to emulate other Western Arab countries. Women were still kept with veils of seclusion, and even though they did work in the workforce, they were kept separate from the men. So looking back at global development, when we look at some of the current key focus for USAID's policies, education, reproductive health, mortality, gender-based violence, paid employment and asset ownership, participation, governance, legal rights, crisis, conflict, and natural disasters, these kinds of issues around women's empowerment and the pictures that are shown here, male involvement with women and childbearing, women doing tasks or jobs that are not normally ones that we think women do. Some of this resonates for me very much with some of the Western feminist things that we have been trying to do as a country. Get more girls into STEM education or that kind of thing. And there's been a lot of progress made over the last 15 to 20 years in terms of some of the indicators around women's empowerment. More and more women are getting educated. About equal numbers of girls and boys are now getting educated in terms of primary education around the world. Infant mortality rates, especially for girls, have been dropping, and maternal mortality rates have been dropping as well. And so, more women are getting involved with the workforce, more women are getting involved with government, and we might, for the first time in the US, have a woman leader as president. There have been a number of countries around the world who have had women leaders, and we're not yet one of them, so we can keep working on that. But even with all of this push and positive push towards gender equality, sometimes when we're trying to make change in terms of women's empowerment, it doesn't always work out the way we think it should. So I'm going to share two stories currently about different kinds of programs that have been looking at women's empowerment and women's status, and some of the lessons we can learn from what's working and what's not working and how they've been done. One is drawn a few years ago in Pakistan, looking at civil engagement in Karachi. And Karachi is the industrial center of Pakistan. Just to give you a little bit of background, Pakistan has been having a significant amount of income inequality due to some of the IMF issues or other kinds of World Bank and development issues. And so they have had a lot of income inequity, just like we have in the US. And this article was looking at the working poor and the garment factories that produce garments, women working in areas. So there's a nonprofit working in Karachi with women who are working in the garment industry. And these women working in the garment industry are having some trouble in terms of both workforce and domestically. Unions are banned in Pakistan, and so the nonprofit has been working with women for workplace rights. But there's also an issue in even getting to the workplace because women are having to navigate public spaces and they're getting harassed when they're going to work. And this happens in a number of countries. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago there had been an incident, Indian woman taking buses to work in Delhi or one of their large cities, and she'd been raped and it caused a huge uproar. So traversing public spaces as a woman, even in the 21st century, is still a problem. So the nonprofit is an advocacy organization, and it has really been pushing to have the women advocate for legal change and civic engagement to change some of the workplace rules and change some of the public harassment. And Sophia is one of those who had been in a group that this nonprofit was working with. She is from the neighborhood. A lot of the women in this particular working neighborhood are working in factories and are having the same kinds of issues. She is originally from Bangladesh. Like a lot of her had married an older man, sometimes 20 or 30 years older, so she's already a widow, and she's having to work in order to support her family. Another woman in the group that Sophia knows, Hasina Begum, is married, and her husband is still alive, but he's a drug addict because of the income inequity and a lot of the unemployment in Pakistan. A lot of the men are employed and they're turning to drugs instead. So both Sophia and her friend are having to work in the garment industry to make money so that they can send their kids to school, have money for their daughters when they go to marry, and that kind of thing. While the NGO has been trying to basically politicize the women in this group and get them to act up and make change happen, the women have been averse to doing it in the ways that the activist nonprofit wants. Sophia says, for example, with traversing the public spaces, even if we're covered, working women are always disrespectable. Only women whose husbands and brothers work are respectable. So they're feeling that they're already being termed as not respectable, even though they consider themselves to be very respectable and are working for the benefit of their family. And the quote shows that Sophia and the other women are well aware of some of the bigger structural issues in the society that are causing the problem. It's not just because men are bums. It's if there are no jobs for them, the men, and there's also an overall low level of education, these men are frustrated. If they have regular employment, they will not think about women, and they won't be standing on the street corners harassing the women as they go to work or stand by the bus stops. So even though the activist nonprofit has very good intentions in terms of trying to get the women to take control, civil control over their situation, the women are saying that it's not as easy as that. They don't want to push that much in terms of legal reforms. They live in this community, in this neighborhood, so they want to find more informal ways to make this change happen that won't necessarily push to the same extent that the activist group wants them to push. And while they do want to go out and to be able to move freely around Karachi society and go and do the things that men do, they also understand that there are other reasons why this is not possible. And the woman whose husband is a drug dealer, not a drug dealer, but a drug addict, is conflicted because she doesn't want that to be the case. She doesn't want to have to go out and work, but she feels that she needs to be a dutiful wife and take care of him. So they both want to be assertive and enjoy some of the freedoms that they don't have, but they also want to show that they're being dutiful and honorable and respectable in terms of their own identity. The final thing I'll talk about today is an example from Nepal in the mid-90s, looking at how organizations were mapping or not mapping gender and power relations around HIV/AIDS prevention messages. In the 90s, Nepal had just been, there was a push that was just going on in the country to have them start talking about HIV prevention. And there was lots of organizations and literature out there working with nonprofits to get AIDS, HIV educators out there talking about what was going on. This is, again, a very well-intentioned global development project, series of projects that maybe didn't work out in as effective a way as it could have. When these nonprofits were looking at getting people to talk more freely about HIV and HIV prevention, the focus had been to use a scientific, decontextualized, politically correct, neutral language was in the guidelines. And it sounds wonderful culturally. You're supposed to, they had an AIDS awareness training exercise that everybody did, where you go in and you have people start saying all of the nice words and the not nice words for sexual organs and sexual acts so that people would get more comfortable talking about sex, and this was supposed to make it easier for them to talk about sex prevention in communities. And from the UNDP guidelines, it said the language should be neutral, gender sensitive, and empowering rather than disempowering. The problem was this wasn't how people talked about sex in Nepal. The whole concept of having a scientific, decontextualized way to talk about sexuality wasn't even that recent in terms of our own Western culture. It's been about 100 years ago that we've started talking about neutral words for sexuality. And when the Nepali educators would try to translate this kind of stuff, the words were stilted and they weren't going anywhere. So an anthropologist, had gone and was talking with some of the Nepali people looking at this, and they came up with an idea of how you could do it differently. Instead of using a language that didn't resonate with Nepalis, they started doing a brainstorming session, coming up with words for husband, wife, mistress, second wife, inside wife, outside wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, lover, ladies' man, slut. So all of these terms contain unmistakable connotations of status, power, rights, obligations, and duties. The status, rights, obligations of the woman to the man, the status, rights, and obligations of the man to the woman when you're in this kind of a relationship. And they even developed a small glossary that they could use, that the HIV educators could use with some of these terms, because when they talked about risk and using this kind of terminology, people understood, Nepalis understood if they were doing risky behavior or not. But it ended up not going anywhere because it didn't fit in with the global development way of doing things. It came from an outsider, not from someone within the global development community. And I mean, speaking as an insider, as a global health worker, it's very difficult when you're working on a program and you have a certain set of deliverables that have to be done by a certain time, and you have to present information in a way that makes sense to the donor who's sitting in the United States or elsewhere and who's not part of the community. It's really hard, even as a development worker who wants to do things right, when you're in that kind of a structure, it's hard to do things the right way instead of the wrong way. So basically I want to end with, when we're talking about gender and sexuality, or not even sexuality, but gender and women's roles and women's empowerment, it's not a black and white issue. People have different perspectives on it as women, and as women in different societies and different cultures. And we need to, if we're looking at changing some of this stuff or improving this stuff, whether it's for ourselves within our own culture or working with other cultures, we need to be able to take the time to reflect on what it means, how it's come about, what the different people are thinking, so that it's not just us doing kind of a top-down global development, even supported by all of the UN agencies. This is the way to do it, but that we provide space so that the voices of the community that we're trying to help are actually heard. So, any questions? Yes. Let's see. Well, I had been looking at the UN Women site that the UN had pulled together all the women in development. They have they have a book looking at current status. There's also, remember the Millennium Development Goals? If you Google that, they've got some updates on how Millennium Development. And even on here, there's a link to the Sustainable Development Goals video where they talk, and the links on the slide, where they talk about what the Millennium Development Goals accomplished, and what the Sustainable Developments want to do. So a lot of it would be like UN, World Bank, WHO, all those different organizations have collected data on different kinds of women's issues, looking at either employment-wise, health-wise, that kind of thing. And so you can look at some of the indicators there. There's also a website, I think it's Gapminder, and some others where they've done data visualization tools, and they've looked at, there's like some epidemiologists and stuff who have, they've done some TED Talks where they look at 1950s and today and trace different countries and trace graphically, visually on a graph how those changes have happened. So there's a lot of different data out there, and hopefully that helps. Yes?
Hi, Jennifer. Back in the beginning, you began to talk about goals, and you had a slide, and it was the SDG goals.
Yep, the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah. Sorry. Yep.
Those goals, there are 17 of them, and are they listed in the priorities which they're working, or are there individuals, groups, organizations working on their specific focus?
These are overall, and so both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development ones have been basically set up on a global level of these are the things we as a world want to accomplish in this time frame. And so a lot of different organizations, if you look at CARE or Save the Children or others, they will list, they will showcase what they've been doing and their accomplishments, kind of grouped by a lot of these goals. So some organizations may end up, like a lot of the green or sustainability kinds of organizations may focus more on affordable and sustainable energy, for example, or protecting the ocean or stopping climate change or that kind of thing. But depending on the organization, they could be looking at a number of these different goals. And some of the goals, like water and sanitation, overlap from engineering to health to other kinds of things. So because they've tried, they were successful with the Millennium Development Goals, really making some substantial change. So they've expanded it, but they found it's been really useful to have this kind of core group of everybody focused in the same way thing happening, so that even though multiple people are doing a lot of different things, you're getting a big bang for the buck. Another example of that right quick is in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a international organization set up to look at cook stoves, because women cooking over cook stoves, whether it's fire or dung or other kinds of things, is a huge health hazard. It turns out some of the studies of women in India sitting over a fire cooking, and an hour of the smoke that they're getting from that fire is the equivalent of smoking 400 cigarettes. And we know how bad cigarettes are for people's health. And so the Clinton, Global Clinton Initiative, Clinton's foundation, they basically got behind and brought together all of the organizations working on cook stoves, because even when I was doing Peace Corps in the 80s, we were working on clean cook stoves for Nepal, but it was piecemeal. And so they've brought together all of these people working on cook stoves together and are hoping to make a lot bigger strides, because it's grouped as one and not a lot of different people doing their own thing.
I just recently watched an informational show about cook stoves, and they have developed a cook stove that has
It's very cool. And one of the things the Cook Stove Alliance has been trying to do is bring in, because this is a big thing in the US, is market economy. And so they've been trying to make the cook stoves, the better quality product cook stoves, marketable. And so it would be private enterprise going out, buying and selling. And so they're looking not just at efficiencies and sustainability, but colors and what kinds of product aspects do women want, so that they can make this a sustainable, market-driven improvement and not just a donor doing a one-time handout or something like that.
One
Yes.
is how to locate the has the mission to pursue gender equality, or they're outreach by the UN agency to who are
Right.
they,
There's no specific group of women. I think a lot of the development agencies have incorporated, it used to be called Women in Development, as part of their agenda. But for a lot, like in the 70s and on when it was put in, it would be pretty tangential. You would have a development program to do clean water, and you would, include some language or some piece about, oh, we have to make this gender equality women friendly or something, but it would be an add-on, it wouldn't be central to it. And so with the looking at, this is the Gender Equity and Female Empowerment Policy for USAID. There's been a focus here or with the UN Women Organization or other organizations to try to get gender equality and gender empowerment front and center, but it's still marginalized, even with this greater focus on making them a part of the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainability Development Goals, getting the international conferences behind it, getting it at a UN kind of country leader level. It still can be a little on the margins and not quite so much center focused. But any organization working in development, it's kind of like the ones working with the Sustainable Development Goals. Some have a focus on women, girls' education, that kind of stuff. Some may not. It kind of depends on the organization and what they want to do.
So is these different countries themselves are having a corresponding organization like established by UN?
Well,
From their local place.
right. So like the UN had 4 different groups, a research group, the UNIFEM, UN Development Fund, a couple of other women's offices and stuff as part of the UN system. And they combine that into a UN Women, which gets input. I think they have a commission on women. And so it gets input from a lot of different countries. But with what happens with the UN system and these international conferences and stuff is that the countries get pressure basically from these kinds of things to start taking some of these policies, like women empowerment policies, and enacting them in their own country. So there's a certain degree of pressure from the UN and global peer pressure to make this happen more, but the countries themselves figure out how they want to make that happen within their own country. So whether you're talking about the WHO or UNICEF or UNAIDS or UN Women or whatever, the UN agencies kind of try to provide overall guidance and standardization, but the countries themselves are responsible for figuring out their own interventions and how they want to go about it, whether it's through country programs, like government programs, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, or whether it's with nonprofits within that country, or how that works.
Thank you. And the second question is to whom that the wailing is a sign of freedom?
So for some of the women, like the ones who had, like the ones here who are seeing it as their choice, their right, their life, some of them like to wear it because they're religious Muslims and they see this as being something that supports their faith, and so they're happy to wear that as part of supporting their faith. They had students blogging about why they wear their job or others. Some said, when I don't feel like dressing up, I wear it because then I can just go out and nobody knows that I'm just wearing slobby gym clothes underneath. Sometimes women like it because they feel like they're going out on the street and they're not getting harassed as they would be if they were wearing more Western clothes. It lets them be anonymous and lets them blend in. So there are a number of reasons why women can choose to veil or not veil. Even from historic times, like back in the Assyrian times when women first started veiling and secluding themselves, the urban women did. A lot of the rural women couldn't because they had to work in the fields and wearing that kind of thing didn't go. But as time progressed and the urban women sometimes started saying, oh, I'm not going to veil, I'm this free urban woman, then it would get picked up by more the middle class or the rural people because they would see it as a status symbol from having enough money that you didn't have to be unveiled. And so sometimes you would have the wealthier women discarding the veil and middle class women putting it on for two very different reasons. So it's like Lois Beckett said, veiling, it kind of comes and goes, veiling and seclusion, but what's important to focus on more are fundamental issues with education and inheritance and legal rights and that kind of thing. Whether women decide to veil or not veil, or seclude themselves or not seclude themselves, is less of an issue than can they go to school, can they vote, can they keep property, and that kind of thing. Any other questions? Oh, cool. Thank you all very much.